Thank you, Martha, and welcome you all. Especially, I'd like to thank you and welcome the panelists. We have a great, honorable panelist from people in Chile. We'd like to thank you all. To begin, I'd like to ask the minister very simple questions. What are the programs or policies in Chile to reopen the country? Okay, thank you for your invitation to this interesting panel. And these are topics that we will be covering for many months. And this is one of the difficulties that we've had to apply political policies that are sustainable in time. There's this temptation of creating public policies on a short-term basis, but they're not sustainable. And the truth is that what we've done is to create a strategy from the very beginning. When the very first spread of coronavirus was seen in Chile, we started to make progressive policies. So we've been balancing the sanitation with a level of economic activities that allow people to be supplied of goods and services early on. For instance, public transportation, always with all the sanitary protocols in place, which are absolutely necessary, and also creating little by little a cultural change that demands people to take care of themselves and those around them. And from that viewpoint, with this pandemic, we are seeing the importance that we do live in a community and that we have to take care of each other. It will be the only way that we can continue taking steps, safe steps, in the next months, because we need to create certain levels of economic activities, because there is no public policy or social policy that has a larger impact than employment and economic activities. So what we're seeing is that here, there are two big pandemics. One is the coronavirus, which creates another pandemic. And it's absolutely important to balance both so that the effect of poverty, of the economic restriction, and the lack of mobility and the containment per se with the coronavirus, that poverty has no compassion with sanitation. So that's the capitalization that we've been taking step by step, trying to reopen with different sanitation protocols in place, while the population culturally implements and takes over and is more aware of what's happening. So what have we done in Chile in terms of public policy? Firstly, sanitation. It's basically what we've done. We have dynamic quarantines, meaning every sector, every commune, every territory has a different level of development of spread. We've been gathering statistics with more tests made on the population to look at the development and the progress made of the spread of the virus in different areas to be able to enable everything has to do with the hospitals to serve those that are mostly affected by the virus. That's one thing. Sanitation. And that's linked to coordinations. We have curfews. People have to be home from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. to be able to avoid also all the transit that's unnecessary. And there are industries that have special permits so that they can operate during those night hours, so if required. On the other hand, we have something that's very important, it has to do with social measures. And these are aid that's given directly to families that are impacted, because this lower economic activity hits hard families, of course. So we've created measures to provide bonds, direct aid, food, to different cities through distribution channels to be able to provide aid to the populations. And then we have economic measures, which basically have three pillars. One, cash flow measures. Why? Because we see that the payments have stopped through this lack of economic activity. And so we've done this through different channels. Early, by delaying tax payments. I won't get into more details. And that releases, of course, pressure on people to have to pay taxes. But we've also made capital injections that are channeled through the banking sector to loan companies money so that they can pay make payrolls and buy their supplies and everything. And the other pillar, it will be announced shortly, is another system in which we will be creating transfers through subsidies, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. It really depends on the ministry involved. And third pillar, there's a law enacted to protect law employment. So with the lower economic activity, the authority can demand the certain productive processes, or the employers and employees can decide on closing the company or temporarily or partially, or work during certain hours of the day. And the unemployment insurance, that is something that the state is paying as well, partly. And that way we can have that balance that is needed structurally throughout the economy of the country. So what's the purpose of all this? The idea is to keep as healthy as possible our economy, to face the reactivation once we have the sanitary conditions that we need with investments, developments, creating jobs, etc. So overall, that's been our strategy. However, every industry has its own particularities, meaning they have their own protocols in sanitation. Through different universities, we've been enabling and certifying the application or use of these sanitary protocols. Sports have been entirely restricted. However, there are some that have been enabled now. So this has been step by step, but we have to be safe with every step. Trade is fundamental. Initially, we opened only pharmacy, drugstores, and supermarkets. But now we have begun to provide authorization. So if you meet the sanitation protocols, you can start to open shopping centers, stores, and other things. So little by little, we've been enabling that. And perhaps something that's very important is that when it comes to the future, because this is just the beginning of the crisis, really. And we have to look at the social impact. But one day, this sanitary crisis will end. So what type of society will we build post-COVID? So we see what's happening in Europe and Canada to see how can we create a society that's developed also respecting nature. We talked about the green recovery, right? Or how we can create capitalism 0.0, in which we have the people in the middle at the core of it. It would be extraordinary to reduce poverty, inequality. However, we need levels of competition so that the companies can have a better field to work on. We have to culturally develop a social market economy in which the person can work beyond the results of the companies, meaning we have a unique opportunity to create a more human oriented economy, because I think that now we're realizing that we need each other and that it's important to continue to develop towards freedom, but always keeping in mind human beings at the core of everything. Thank you, Minister Cristóbal. The minister mentioned the quarantine, the dynamic quarantine, and the fact that Chile has made more tests in gross numbers and percentage of population in Latin America gives you certain confidence of the current situation or the tracking of the virus in China, keeping in mind that program of the dynamic quarantine. What's your idea about that? I think it's very interesting because Chile has been a pioneer because it's made pointing to small areas like municipal quarantines. We just finished a scientific article in which we finished the first stage at the end of April of this dynamic quarantine. Indeed, it was a good complement to help balance the spread of the virus after we've implemented other measures like the closing of schools, large shopping centers, etc. Now, what's interesting that what we've seen is that early May, especially in the greater area of Buenos Aires, the situation has changed. And we has increase of the virus spread, especially when we know that the greater areas are hit hardest. And we're seeing figures that are worse now than early on. So I would say that only time will say how this dynamic quarantines are enough or reasonable for large urban centers like a city like Santiago, where there's a lot of connection of human beings. And it could be reasonable perhaps for smaller cities or dense with less populations. So we could have a quarantine that's focused on a small town. Indeed, it could be enough for like that, something like that. So there's uncertainty, yes. And the Chilean Sanitation Authority is trying to see how to balance these aspects. I think it's very relevant to get out of this dichotomy of should we take care of our health or the economy. I think the pandemic hits our health, the social indicators, the economy, and the economy in turn health. So it's a cycle. More unemployment affects people, and so you have to look at this as a continuous cycle. So the economic, social, and sanitation policy should be comprehensive. And it's been complex to install in practice and to make sense of it all and to disclose it so that everybody can understand it. Something discussed highly in Chile is, where is the strategy? In many European countries, you talk about opening strategies, and you talk about phases, and you talk about this, and this is happening. If the situation is worse, we go back to the quarantine, and that gives like a certainty, or it allows us to anticipate the possible scenarios, not only for the businesses or the people, but for everybody. So that's something we need in Chile. Because what happens early, like at the end of April, is that we start to talk about we're back to normal. But I think that we started to say that way too early. And indeed, for instance, when we opened shopping centers, I think we should reevaluate that on a short-term basis, and we should to reverse some measures of that reopening, because we know that the pandemic will last long. We have to live with it. And one of two things will happen. We'll either have a vaccine or the Chilean population will develop its own immunity. And this won't happen before 18 months, being optimistic. Therefore, we have to understand that during this time, we will have periods in which the pandemic will be hotter, like today, where we have to have measures that are more restrictive in mobility. We will minor chances for the economy to operate normally, and another period where we can monitor the situation to see how things are going. I think that that discussion, open and frank with the people, is very important. We should not give messages that this will happen only once, but instead everything has to be gradual, and that the economic and sanitary measures should be under the same framework. Thank you, Cristóbal. I would like to ask Alejandra and Juan. I have one more question for you, Cristóbal, but before. I understand that epidemiologists never have the test that they want. They never have perfect information. So when you were talking about looking at things day by day or week by week, what factors are you interested in more? I mean, keeping in mind, of course, that Chile and no country can have enough tests to reach a conclusion scientifically safe, but you have to open the economies. So what are the factors that you would be interested in mostly to have a capability to respond to the epidemic is very important. For instance, when we reopen gradually certain economic sectors, we should have the capability to diagnose early and create isolations within a company. For instance, we have a large company that will start to operate, and it needs to have a plan, because when they have a suspicious case, it could be diagnosed, isolated early on to avoid spreads in the company. So those measures are fundamental and part of our design. And then there's a role there of how you inject the resources. Those resources should be given for the reactivation. I mean, everybody, all businesses must adapt internally. Plants won't work the same. There's got to be technology to do whatever's possible and for the people's health, and that will last long. So that's something important. And going back to your question, there are indicators that are key to monitor. So when you can intensify or not the measures, for instance, looking at the ICU units and the number of beds available. If you have an occupation of more than 85% of the beds in the hospitals in a geographic region, it means that the risk to collapse the health system is huge. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. Obviously, the number of cases of COVID, the density, how they're distributed, and the last key factor is what percentages of the new cases can we trace? I mean, it's very different that 50% of the new cases, we don't know where they come from. That talks about uncontrolled epidemiological problem. Instead, that if 10%, we do know their source. So that allows us to know what's our capability of traceability. When more than 90% of the cases, we know where they came from, it gives an indication that indeed we can isolate properly all of the contacts of that case. And of course, that gives us an idea that you can relax a bit the measures safely and keeping the epidemic flow under control. Thank you, Cristóbal. Yes, we made a webinar last week. And the same question stemmed here in Antioquia. It's a very interesting case, especially for Latin America. And of course, we need many more tests. They're focusing a lot on the R factor. And they're using that factor a lot. It's not the only factor, but it's very important for Ethiopia. So now, Alejandra, thank you for your patience. As a representative of entrepreneurs, what has what's your main advice to the government about the quarantine and now the reopening? Firstly, I think that we all agree that we're facing a very complex crisis that has thousands of factors. And what's most important is the health of our people. And that from that and knowing that we have to keep in mind economy and jobs, and there's people that don't have food and a lot of unemployed people, the crisis is much more complex. And as Cristóbal said, we don't know, this won't be for just 3 months. It will go for 6, 9. We have no idea how many months. So the complexity is increasing because if it's only for 3 months, you can find resources and somehow you can help with the economy or you can make other measures. So keeping that in mind, at least in my association of entrepreneurs, we've tried to be part of the solution and we've been seeking measures and trying to advance every day and every month according to what happens and trying to help people. Think about 2 stages. First is to maintain with very few sales or to reactivate selling differently. And that's very important for SMEs because they've been going and resorting a lot to online services. Remember, SMEs live off this. And also, how can we spend months without closing, without firing people, which is the best of both worlds, knowing that no measure is magical. And definitely, we do know that the problem is huge. So here with Minister Palacios and also with Juan, we've been working closely, and that helps a lot because we all know that we can't work in silos. We have to work together. And we've been looking at the dimensions of this, and we've looked at the measures. First, we have the employment subsidy, especially. It was especially for 70% for SMEs. And that way they have been able to continue working and not fire people. Then we also delayed our obligations to pay taxes to the state. And many private companies or banks have also extended their loans, payments of loans. And we have to applaud these sectors for helping us as well, because this is when we need them the most. And then there are other measures like loans that are very bland, very soft at 3.5, which has been historically low worldwide even, especially for the SMEs for working capital and a lot of benefits to extend the payment of their loans. And as we've discussed a lot with Minister Palacios, I understand that through other vehicles, other tools, which are not traditional banks, we can reach a lot of micro enterprises that the traditional banks do not know of or do not consider interesting customers. And so that's how we're working. Secondly, when it comes to SMEs, we have a need to sell. That's pivotal. So what we've done is to train along with Falabella, Mercado Libre, and other platforms on the web. They're not charging any commissions to SMEs, which is great. And with the association, we are training the SME directors because they have to learn how to reinvent themselves. So we have to think how to adapt to the new world. And there are 2 things. How do we sell? That's not physically. And second, how the logistic will allow people to not gather together. So they've got to have that social distancing. So to be able to sell, you have to produce. So how can we take all the sanitary measures so that we can help the most people possible? And our association has also asked the state subsidies, benefits, cash flow, because of the many needs that we have for the small and medium enterprises. We ask business people also to help us, and we also want to thank them because they've been really, really willing to help us. We're all responsible of taking care of our health. We have to take care of our jobs. We have to seek new ways of selling, to be more online. So today, we are responsible of reinventing ourselves. Since we are entrepreneurs, the idea is, how can we adapt to this new world, this new age, these months that have been so different, and to give the best of ourselves because the country needs us. And the worst thing that could happen is that we will lose more jobs and see closures of companies. And this is something that we're all, in every way possible, trying to avoid. No, we know that it's almost impossible if we're not joining efforts. Thank you, Alejandra. Juan, thank you for your patience as well. And also, congratulations for your election for the presidents of this commission of the private sector. Congratulations. My question for you is very similar to that of Alejandra. What's your advice and of your commission, which represents large companies of Chile, to the government? What have you advised the government regarding for the quarantine and reopening? What are the two big advice that you've given the government? Firstly, I'd like to thank you for your invitation to be able to share with you in this debate. Second, responding to your question, our concern has focused basically on two large areas. One, to support to the making of better public policies, and through them to be able to face the emergency and the crisis. In that sense, basically there's been two public policies essential. The Act of Employment, which in Chile was presented in 2018, and the Facts and the Reality, which led the legislators to approve it. But with the COVID, we as large companies have been able to begin with this pandemic to have the social distancing and teleworking. So our concern has been that that policy and that act can be proper. Second, when it comes to the Employment Protection Act, which we worked for hard, the idea is to have employment continuity. And as we've seen in Spain and Europe, the idea is to have two large goals. One, to have continued income for the workers, and to have continued operations of the companies. In addition, we've stated the importance of keeping certain production areas that are strategic, meaning the industry that's very important for the country. The agricultural sector especially. And they've been able to have social distancing and the maximum operation levels. Even we can think that there's no productive decrease in the mining sector, which is very important. And therefore, we're supporting that area and the strategic area, especially for construction and real estate, especially social housing, because we require low-skilled labor for that. And we're also focusing on the responsible management, and we've defended the use of supermarkets, pharmacies, drugstores, mom and pop stores, which are responsibly operated. So we have with them the population supplied and to keep the products constantly available for the population. Even in the States and in some European countries like France, Spain, or in this case, Italy, we've seen that. And this gives stability to the process. Also, we've backed the government because we have to understand that we are in a world. Allow me to, the thing is that it's my phone. Give me a second, please. I'm loading my phone, charging my phone. So we're supporting the government in terms of supplying those fundamental situations in terms of health and food. And we created a fund, which is really one of the largest in the world because when it comes to population and economy. And since Chile is a country that's more Hispanic and not English speaking, I have to remind you that only in Chile you can do what the law allows you. And we can do everything like in English speaking countries. So what we did is provide support to the government, buying ventilators worldwide. Also, we helped the government in purchasing the PCR reactors to increase the number of daily tests up to 50%. We've also supported the quick tests precisely to provide better health care, as Cristóbal mentioned. And this, of course, improves public policies and the sanitation and health of everybody from Chile. So far in the country, we have not taken decisions of who can live and who can die. We haven't reached that because of the good way we have handled our sanitation policy and the timely use of the resources. Lastly, today, we are backing a large percentage of families, I would say 10% of the families that cannot be benefited by social programs because they don't have a social data. Many of them are migrants. Remember, in the second government of Bachelet, there was an inclusion of more than 1 million people that entered the country in very precarious conditions, undocumented as well, that cannot resort to any social benefits. And many of them today, therefore, are backed by our Solidarity Fund of the CPC. And we're in charge of feeding these families. this is basically what we're doing at CPC. And lastly, with the reopening of the economy, we are concerned about how we can build public policies with the government. We've had different meetings, and the main concern is how to work now on the social issues to build the best public policies and with specific activities to reopen our economy. I think that this is one of the most relevant crises of mankind's history, because technology, yes, has helped us with these meetings, but we are precarious, especially in developed countries like ours. So there we have a huge challenge to face. And also we are very worried. Let me give you an example. Several days ago, we met with the chairman of the Association of Banks and the chairman of the Association of Industries of Spain. Since they have experienced this COVID 2 months before us, the idea was to see what they've done, so what we will do and we won't do. And so what we saw after that meeting is that we not only have in Chile a social crisis, but we have to face not only how to jumpstart our economy, everybody has to do it, but also we have to boost our contribution to the future, and in what conditions we'll do this because of the social crisis that has many demands and has a huge problem of violence that we have seen on the streets, which of course could make things even more difficult to jumpstart our economy. So I think that these are the main concerns we've had. We are working strongly with the government as well as all the public and private sectors, especially supporting in our sphere the entire systemic chain, especially the SMEs that depend, of course, on large companies as well. That's our big contribution. Thank you, Juan. Alejandra, let me go back to you. Do you agree with the policy of the SMEs? Is it consistent with what Juan has said? Or are there differences between the CPC and your federation, your confederation? I think the crisis has hit everybody. A large company cannot work and cannot be productive if the small companies can't. So yes, SMEs depend on large companies, and vice versa. We've asked, for instance, the large companies, we've met with Juan many times, not only with them, but all the business people, telling them that we more support than ever, because the idea is to get the payroll on time, to help us with things that are very important for us as SMEs. I mean, the support of a small company in cash flow to be able to survive 2 or 3 months without sales is null. I mean, there are very few companies in Chile can stand without selling 2 or 3 months, not even one. There's a study that says that most of the SMEs in Chile, like in most economies, of course, do not last 27 days without selling. So the financing to be able to sell, that payments arrive, to take care of the cash flow, that's like the top priority. And that way you can take care of jobs. But I think that this systemic problem hurts not one, but everybody. It's not a problem of mine and not of the others. We're all affected one way or another. I feel that after we had a social crisis and a revolution in Chile, we saw clearly what are our headaches. We have a platform where you see item 1, 2, and 3, very clear problems that started to divide the country. And there's violence, and our country is angry and divided. But with this pandemic, it forces us to understand that we cannot divide ourselves. We've got to work together. This is complex. We all need each other significantly. I can't imagine that one can work in a large company without small providers, or the state cannot work without SMEs as well. So we all need each other. What's important is that we have to be generous, and we have to be available and willing to give the best of ourselves to surpass this crisis, because this is really the worst thing we've experienced. We don't know the dimension, the true dimension. We have no idea what's going to happen in a month. So we have to work day by day, hard, and each one of us have to be generous, especially if we have an opportunity. So that way, I think that it's time to work together. Otherwise, or we do it all together, or we all die together. And I also feel that this crisis, as an entrepreneur, we know that this gives us an idea of, okay, how can we face our headaches in Chile? How can we solve them? Because after the pandemic, the idea is not to go back to be divided. That's a big challenge that we all have. Because after this economic and healthcare crisis, if we have another social crisis, I really think it would be even worse. And in that sense, with the SMEs since October 18th, we can see that the pandemic, which is so important, has hurt us really bad. So again, I feel that this is not about being from the left or from the right, academics. I mean, we've got to sit all together, find solutions together. Thank you, Alejandra. Now, Minister, you have been very patient. Thank you. I have questions from the listeners for you, but also I would like to give you time to answer everything that you've done so far. Thank you. Firstly, I would like to thank Alejandra Mustakis for the excellent work and the leadership she's had for the entrepreneurs of Chile, as well as Juan Sutil, because your work has been extremely generous. If somebody thinks that the state itself can solve this crisis that we have, you're wrong. And from that viewpoint, I agree with what's been said. This really is an opportunity. It's a historical challenge that our country has to join efforts to move on. The same cartoon that there are companies that are more important than others is ridiculous to me, because the entire economy, all the companies are important, because an economy is interrelated, of course. Everybody's interrelated. I would also like to say that I agree with Cristóbal, Cuadrado, because there is no dichotomy between what's sanitation and the activity in the life of people, provided we can gradually apply all of the measures needed so that the people can have better health. And that also happens culturally. We have been learning and will continue to learn to live with the situation for many months. And we have to be very generous for this. Take care of ourselves and others, of course. I would like to talk about three last things. First, all of the measures that we've been creating, especially for capital injection, have the difficulty, but they've got to be timely. This crisis has to be managed in time. And there are some measures that are urgent, and that demands that we have to give much more of ourselves as a society so that the aid won't get to the people late. It's got to be there timely. It's not only about having the resources, but how to make the resources arrive to the hands of the people on a timely basis. So I'd like to say to Cristóbal that we do have a strategy, progressive, that along with the other ministries, and I think we should disclose it and show it to everybody. And the idea is to see what other countries have done in this case to avoid mistakes, making mistakes here. We're also somehow learning about this together with the private sector. We are trying to find the best paths for everybody. And culturally, the digitalization has been incredible. And this is a reality, like teleworking, working at home. It's here to stay. We're going to have to get that into our head. Especially with the small companies, they've been able to subsist because of online sales. So digitalization is something that we have to make more common for people to access. It was also said, today we have tools like technology that allows us to talk with others in other parts of the world. However, there is a tool that we must, and it's our humanity. I mean, this is a crisis of humanity, of mankind. And the most important tool to survive is mankind, to help each other. I've had the extraordinary experience of working with people in different sectors of the politicians and business people, because we have a common problem. And with that commonality, we can solve it better. And that is a great opportunity to build the Chile that we want for the future. Thank you, Minister. Let's try to answer several questions made by our listeners. Here, almost everybody's asking for the minister. Let's see how many we can answer. First, what is the foreign investments role and how is it implemented to this emergency in your country? That's a very good question, because in Chile, we are a small country. We have 29 FTAs, meaning that we have treaties with 66 countries. And the most important investment created in our country, or very important, comes from foreign capital. So we make follow-ups of the 12 most significant investments. And we've had ongoing relations with them. So those projects will only be delayed, but not canceled. And we've had good reception. We've had to explain our political processes. For instance, in Chile, we have an institutional and macroeconomic strength that's been in operation for 3 decades. And that has led to significant trust from investors, because their purpose is to see long-term investments. And perhaps what created some fear was the social outbreak that we had in October. And then we started to see how it mitigated. The economy started to show its resilience. So in January and February, it started to go back to the activities, but then March came with the coronavirus. and we had to face this other problem. So many investment decisions had to be pushed back. Right now, our foreign investment is at 8.3%. So there is an important restriction there. But next year, we will reactivate that. And something else that created some fear was the constitutional discussion, because everybody needs legal certainty to invest. And I want to be clear, I've gone to 8 countries, many countries, to talk about the margin and the discussion. The constitutional discussion is something that we need in Chile, because it's based on 4 pillars. 1, Chile will continue being a democracy. 2nd, Chile will continue being a representative republic. 3rd, Chile will respect the courts and all of the trials or the rules that have existed, prior rules. And 4th, which is very important, Chile will respect its free trade agreements and all the international treaties. What does this mean? It means the reciprocity of investments with other countries with which we have treaties, and respecting international treaties, for instance, that with San Jose, Costa Rica, which has to do with human rights, but also private property. So with that viewpoint, we're talking about a common desk, and we are starting from zero. There are things that surely we have to change, but the substantial, the most significant pillars are there. So when you closely explain the desk that determines this discussion, that gives peace of mind to international investors, because we need to have that legal certainty for the investors, national and international. And that's the path that we've determined. Thank you, Minister. There's a question, and it says, and I think all of you can answer it as well, the others. Allow me to ask it. And it has to do with the possible second wave of the outbreak. We received questions here of the fear with the winter time in Chile, which can bring another outbreak, strong outbreak. So the question for all of the panelists, depending on your expertise. And I relate that, I mean, Minister, if there's a second wave, or if you see that the numbers are not good or as good as you expected, will it be easy to close the economy again? And if so, how can you do so? Because I can imagine that this contingency has to be planned for as well, right? Yes, that's a good question. Because if there's something that we've learned so far, is that the policies that we implement have got to be flexible to react. If they're rigid, it makes it more difficult to react to situations of outbreaks that are not predictable, right? So early on, when we created the protocol to be able to open in the supply chain, to keep the supply chain healthy, or the supermarkets, then we started to flex or change or demand more from the producers. For instance, if they have a worker in the supermarket that had the COVID, so how can this sector that's so fundamental for the population, how can they keep together if they have a worker that's sick? So we start to modify all the protocols to start to see how the operation could go on. The same with the offices where we work. We've generated specific protocols early on, and then everybody went home. Now they're starting to come back to the offices, but we're modifying everything so that we can have a system, people at a certain distance with different protocols, confinement of other sectors, if there's a person that gets sick. So we have to be flexible enough to respond to a crisis that develops with time, for good or for bad. Early on, we thought it would grow strong and then fall, and then it seems it's like a wave. We have to be flexible enough. And that is what dynamic quarantines are all about. It's very different to talk about a sector like Santiago than that of an island. The climate conditions are different, the vitality is different, the rural and urban areas are very different. There are dense areas with populations, so we've got to have enough tools to look at the different realities, and that's something that we start learning about every day. And this, of course, demands a lot of flexibility, and that's why we've started to compartmentalize different regions so that we can have this. So we go back to this dichotomy of the economy and the sanitation. They need each other, but we've got to have the protocols, yes, but we've got to be flexible enough to serve the reality as it changes. But remember, not all areas are the same. So how can you open shopping centers? That's a wide opening. You can open small stores. There are other large stores that can open as well, that can open just one or two doors. I mean, everything is part of the protocol. So the idea is to create a single rule for everyone is very difficult. So we have this cultural lesson that we've had. Thank you, Minister. I don't want to abuse the time of our panelists. However, I would like if you could give each of you a minute to answer the another question. Juan, what's your idea about the same question? Well, I believe that the minister is right when he talks about a flexible policy, because we are facing an epidemic that's also flexible. However, we do have the option of flattening the curve beforehand. So having a policy that allows social distancing, the people's responsibility, protections in companies and work sites and at homes is absolutely compatible with decreasing this incidence or damage within society, and of course within the economy. I do worry about the situation of the world and the world economy, really, because as the minister said, we have 64 free trade agreements, and that's very good for our development, but it makes us dependent on other countries, and it's a big influence in our products, the products that we export. So I would like to have preventive measures, and that way we can maintain, without risking the health of the people from Chile, to keep certain levels of production. Thank you, Juan. Cristóbal? Yes, thank you. I underline what Juan has said, because the idea is to maintain, during the different stages of this epidemic, the best information possible to be able to give the biggest priority to the health of our population, and to look at the measures. The measures that we implement have to be timely, they have to be effective. We cannot work with delayed measures. We have to be very logical. We don't want bad consequences. And lastly, we need legitimate measures. Those components will help us with our sanitation, social, and economic policies. And that to do with what I said early on of why we should disclose all this, put all of what we've done in writing, and this way we can have the triggers and the dynamics of marketing does have its good effects. We need a proper plan, but we have to disclose it with everybody so that the citizens can really see that the decisions are made keeping everybody in mind. And I believe that that's fundamental so that we face what's coming. I believe that the role of the social desk of the government is key. It's got to have a clear role to find elements or discuss elements that have to do with sanitation, the economy. So different actors can be at that desk. I think that's very important. That the health system also should have a seat in that desk. And also remember the complexity of this pandemic has to keep in mind a very clear communication because we have to show what we're doing to the people. Thank you, Cristóbal. Alejandra, you have the last word. Thank you for inviting me here with such great company with Cristóbal, Juan, the minister, who we want to thank so much, who's worked 24/7. You all three have working hard for the country. And I would just like to say that although we're living this difficult time, I agree with what the other three gentlemen have said. And I'd like to add, let's talk about the good things that happen with these problems. For instance, I've never seen the will of the business world, the political world, the academic world, of the entrepreneurs, of getting together, of trying to see how we can help to move on. How can we really pitch in so we can get out of this crisis? As the minister said, the state cannot provide the only solution. We all have to pitch in. So in that sense, this is the biggest thing because the strategy has to be proven. And the only thing we can do is have a best team possible and to be able to, and that way we can have the best decisions, the most legitimate decisions, and to be timely. Because if we start to discuss and mediate and we don't have a good team, the decisions made will not be the best. And that we will, with that, die. Large and small enterprises will break, will close, and that, of course, will affect the mental health of our country as well. Remember, jobs are important to everybody. So if you don't have health, if you don't know about your future for tomorrow, we have to take care of all of these areas. So when it comes to that sensation of safety, we have to avoid people from feeling depressed. Of being in quarantine itself. So this crisis is really giving way to a storm so to be able to be agile and to make the best decisions. I'm really, really glad to see the will of the private and public sector to help everyone. So to end, everybody here in Chile wants to move on. And tomorrow, when we look back, the idea is to say, okay, after this storm and with this huge will and with the complexity of this crisis, we got together and we do have a better country. Alejandra, what a great note to touch to end. So if I understand, the conclusion is yes, we can. That's the big message that I've heard from you. So close the session, panelists. As I said early, it's a great panel. And as Martha said, it's the second webinar that we've held exclusively devoted to Chile. And I know it won't be the last. Chile is a very important country. For Canada, the relationship between both countries is very important for both countries. So with this, I close the session. And again, thank you, the panelists, and those that are listening to us today. Thank you, and have a good day.